This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
Okay. All right, folks. Welcome. I'm Ara Bagdasarian, the board president of ZeroNow, and welcome to ZeroNow Sessions, this webinar series, The Future of Active Shooter Prevention Protocols, the second in a series of active shooter prevention approaches for campuses. And just want to recognize that today's the 9-year anniversary of the Sandy Hook school shooting, and recent events have made this topic even more relevant and even more important for us to work together to get to zero harm in schools now. Some background: ZeroNow is a stakeholder alliance formed to drive innovation, awareness, funding, and policy for safer campuses. As a member-based nonprofit, ZeroNow facilitates collaboration between industry, association, and education partners to foster new solutions to keep our campuses safe and secure. Before we get started, we want to recognize our sponsors and founding partners who made this program possible, this free program. Thank you to Access Communications, Additional Corporation, Telos Corporation, OmniAlert, IACLEA, VTV Family Outreach Foundation, and NASPA, the Student Affairs Administrations in Higher Education. If you're interested in learning more about ZeroNow or becoming a member, please visit zeronow.org, and at the end of the program, you'll receive an email also to give you the opportunity to do that. So before getting started with our panelists, I'm going to go ahead and push a poll out here and get your feedback, and then we'll circle back with this. So the question is, what type of active shooter policies does your organization employ? Do you have a prevention program, a response program, both prevention response, or none at all this time? So we'll let you go ahead and continue that poll. And while you're doing that, let me introduce our panelists for this session, our distinguished presenters and speakers. So first of all, Brandon Rhone. Brandon's been in law enforcement for 17 years. He spent 10 years in patrol, then was promoted to the rank of captain before his retirement. As captain of operations, Brandon was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the agency and was commander of the SRO unit. Brandon is a certified school resource officer through the National Association of School Resource Officers. Today, Brandon shares his experience as assistant director of ALICE training at Navigate 360, and he's also a school board member, which I just learned. Same with our second speaker today, Jonathan Kassa. Jonathan provides national thought leadership and expertise in campus public safety policy and practices. He's led innovative national initiatives to increase community-oriented safety, security, and victim advocacy in a career spanning over 25 years. He previously served as National Director of Education Services at North America's largest contract security firm. He's a former executive director of the Cleary Center, serving post-Virginia Tech tragedy. Jonathan influenced Cleary legislation such as emergency notification and hate bias crime reporting, and was entered as a valuable leader in campus safety in the 2008 congressional record. During this time, he guided the development of the Campus SAVE Act, which eventually was adopted into law and part of the Violence Against Women Act. Jonathan is a board member at the National Network of Victim Assistance and was just reelected for another 4-year term to serve as school board director for one of Pennsylvania's largest school districts, where he chairs the Safe Schools Committee. Welcome, Jonathan. And our third guest today is Jonathan Grollneck. Many of you probably know Jonathan or Chris. Chris is an award-winning retired police detective and one of the nation's highly respected policy experts in preventing domestic terrorism events. Recognized as a leader in police and public safety initiatives, Chris has experience advising the highest levels of government and corporate executives, governors, presidential candidates, and political think tanks. Often call upon Chris's experience, which includes time spent testifying to the White House and Senate committees. Under oath, Chris gave testimony regarding the need for specific counterterrorism initiatives at the behest of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Notably, one of Chris's most recent significant achievements was being selected to advise McKinsey Institute in Canada of the phenomena of active shooters in America and abroad. So welcome, gentlemen. So before we, let's go ahead and take a look at the poll results here. So it looks like most of the organizations, hopefully you could all see this here. Both, so that's good. That is a good percentage that is doing both prevention and response. So, Chris, are you surprised with those results? Is that what you're seeing as far as the makeup in the organizations that you work with?
Right. So I'm not surprised by the results because I think everybody believes they have a prevention and a response plan. But I think that the common denominator, after speaking to an absurd number of people about the subject, most believe that their response plan is part of the prevention because they're preventing the loss of more lives after they start the response of what I call failed prevention when it's too late. So if something goes wrong, we know something failed along the way. So it's preventing more victims. But if we look left of that side, prevention is a very strong topic. And when you dive down into those types of policies, few actually believe that's even possible.
And actually, before I ask Jonathan and Brandon, if you have questions, please use the Q&A button rather than using the chat. There's a Q&A button, and we'll get to those. We had a number of questions that came in beforehand for registration, so go ahead and do those, and we'll circle back with those a little bit later. Jonathan and Brandon, just like your school districts, what types of active shooter prevention protocols are you employing? And we'll start with Jonathan.
I think it's important to recognize we need multiple modalities, right? There's a strategy and then the different tactics that go into that. And we'll get into more details, of course, into some of what's already been proven effective or evidence-based, but also what's being developed. I think that's what's important as we try to keep ahead of what seems to be a new type of crisis each week in active shooters on school campuses. One of the areas that is a elected board official who's always very concerned about the policies and then how that occurs in practice. No matter what we say we're doing, are we actually doing that? I'm always reminded by Max Schachter, who lost his son Alex at Marjorie Stoneman High School. And he always says, you could have behavioral threat assessment program. You could say you're a safe school and have all these policies and programs, but is it just a paper tiger? And so that's what keeps me up at night. Are we saying or are we doing?
Brandon,
I would agree with that. There is certainly a difference in checking the box, right? And so organizations need to be really careful about doing just that to be able to say we did, we have it. And so it's important to have that prevention and response component to any whatever your plan is, right? Because the reality is that we all want to prevent these type of attacks, right? We all want to find the way to stop these. But in the meantime, when one of these violent critical incidents occurs, if the prevention was not successful, you better have a way to deal with it. And so it's really important that both prevention and response and even recovery, right? And that's a whole nother topic down the road. But all three of those really work hand in hand. And so it's vitally important that organizations have prevention, because we have seen, right? And we'll talk about some of them. We have seen organizations who have been able to prevent these type of attacks, right? Whether it be through see something, say something. We know that leakage happens. Leakage is a real thing. But we also know that there's, I'll use, for lack of a better term, right? There's street code of conduct where folks are afraid of reporting because they're worried about the retribution or the retaliation of reporting, but the leakage is there, and so the prevention is certainly key and priority. But if we can't prevent it, we got to be able to deal with it when it happens.
No, exactly. That's the key, and getting it on the front end is absolutely critical. So let's talk about the standard protocol: run, hide, fight. And Chris, how effective is the run, hide, fight approach? I know that is probably the most widely adopted active shooter protocol. What are your thoughts on that?
I think in 2013, it was a great strategy. It kind of followed the stop, drop, and roll. You know, we lost so many kids in school fires 63 years ago. We had to stop, and we haven't lost one since. So they came up with a 3-word, quick to remember, run, hide, fight. And the problem with that is as we've evolved, we forgot to evolve with it. So it's fairly, I mean, no disrespect, I helped to develop it, but it's fairly hollow still. We haven't taken it to the next level. And I think what we need to do is look at each tenet of the run, the hide, and the fight and see, does that truly work? And, you know, sticking within some parameters that I'm bound by, a school shooting that I've worked recently, the kids that ran into the shooter. The kids that hid were shot behind doors. The person that fought was killed on scene. And the reason is there's 1,000 experts out there, and I mean that probably lightly. There's probably well over that, teaching different active shooter protocols with no national standard. I mean, ALICE is fantastic. The alert standard is fantastic. Any response by police is fantastic. School boards making sure they're doing what they say, perfect. And all the new initiatives. Where we run into problems is there's not a standardized, what does run mean, what does hide mean, what does fight mean? And we leave out cover and concealment and some other, you know, tactical objectives. And we just are looking at the strategy. And I think Jonathan alluded to this, or Brandon alluded to this brilliantly. While we think we know what we're going, are we really going in that direction? And be careful the outcome you're asking for, because you think you're doing something, and therefore, and then again, something goes terribly wrong at that moment. It's not the right time to know that your strategy or even your tactical position was, you know, incorrect.
So Brandon, I mean, how does ALICE, the ALICE approach differ from run, hide, fight? Is it related?
So that's a great question, and I thank Chris for teeing that up perfectly, right? Because when you know, to not reiterate what Chris just said, but when you look at the difference between ALICE and run, hide, fight, is we take that neuroscience, that human behavior, that kinesiology, understanding human performance, and its age and ability appropriate, right? So when you talk about run, hide, fight, that's, to Chris's point, that's a blanket statement, right? What does run, hide, fight mean in a 5-year-old kindergarten classroom? It means something completely different, right? Because of age and ability appropriate training. So ALICE not only takes in the science behind understanding human performance, understanding how the brain will function in that stress-induced environment, teaching people that there are ways to put themselves in a position to increase their survivability. But we also take it and put to the point of, what does that look like in a 5-year-old kindergarten classroom? What does that look like in a special education classroom with learning support students, right? Or emotional support students, or life skill students. And so ALICE is not just a blanket one size fits all response. It is age and ability appropriate. And so it makes sure that we are empowering folks within their capabilities, within their brain, their ability to understand and process the information. And so it really gets down into understanding why, you know, to Chris's point, right? Run, hide, fight, it's proactive, right? And we've been saying for, you know, the last several years now, we need to be proactive, and we've seen all the research and documentation that supports that. But we have to break that proactive down, right? And so ALICE really gives you that holistic, full, deep-rooted approach versus this 30,000 foot level at all times.
And so let me just come on and ask: does this stuff actually work? Are there actual is prevention actually achievable? Is it possible to avert harm during a situation applying run, hide, fight, or ALICE or other protocols?
Yes, I mean we've seen it in events across the nation. We have never said that at 100% assurance, right, that somebody's not going to get hurt. But what we do say at ALICE is, if we take proactive measures, we can and we will, and we have seen throughout event histories that we have been able to increase survivability, right? And so that's what we're looking to do, right, is to increase that survivability. Because when you look at these incidents, right, we're talking 98% of the time we're dealing with one assailant who comes into a school, a movie theater, a church, pick your venue, that really doesn't matter. But more times than not, that one assailant is outnumbered by 100 to 1 at a minimum, right? And so when you think about, 100 good people versus one bad guy, the numbers, the odds are already on our side. Now let's educate those folks to understand, hey, you need to do something other than go hide in that corner, close the door, turn out the lights, and hope for the best. And so that's a long way to your answer, Ara, of saying, yes, we have seen where option-based proactive strategies have increased and in some cases mitigated the violent critical incident.
On that aspect of the strategies, Jonathan, I was watching a recent interview with the ZeroNow Desensitized series, and you were talking about a community-based approach to prevention. And how would you describe that? What does that actually mean? How can the community participate in prevention?
Sure, and full disclosure, so I started 13 years in juvenile justice at a nonprofit, and you have to look through a lens of multi-systemic approach, right? Our schools, right? Everyone looks; they're a reflection of society's ills, and to that point, we need to make sure that we have resources. We talk about multidisciplinary teams, right? Now, we're talking about protocols, which is very good. Let's take that to proactive, which is another word we're going to hear often. But what's coming out of that are the programs, the holistic programs, which are embedded and extend far beyond when an incident occurs. And what are we doing to kind of balance that checkbook, so to speak, social, emotional learning wise, using positive behavioral interventions and supports? What are we doing years ahead of time, which are actually going to be much more cost effective type of interventions than ignoring? And this is part of America's public policy problem. We have a schism between the K-12 system and higher education, and it's really why we see the same problems happening again and again as children become older, because we don't have the interventions earlier and the programs in place that are proactive and holistic. What we're doing is we're creating many more opportunities for there to be deviations between systems and between interventions. The wider those deviations, the larger the cracks are, so to speak, that an individual who may do harm to themselves or others will fall through.
I'm that guy. I'm that guy. I'm the mute guy. I know that would happen eventually. So when I know there are technologies out there like AI looking for patterns, aggregating information to identify potential threats. Do schools know what to do with that data once a threat is identified? I know recently there have been a number of threats that have been thwarted. Information was sent to the school. A student posting content on social media. What is the most appropriate response for a school administration? Do they pull the student from school? Do they suspend the student? What advice would you provide on that front, Jonathan?
Really for it, and this is where I bring I mentioned the higher ed side of things, but it applies across our education continuum. The more antennas we have up, so to speak, this is about responsiveness, right? The more we're going to listen. Technology can help with that. It can also be a hindrance if we're just collecting information but not acting upon it. So that human element in the feedback loop within our institutions and our school leadership, our board leadership, is very important. And that's why it's a constant evolution. It's never checking the box and just thinking that, well, our schools are safe, we've got this figured out. It's always trying to stay a step ahead. It's tying together programs like the Safe to Say Something program for anonymous and confidential reporting. How's that being tied in with our behavioral threat assessment programs? Also then with our discipline programs? Are we strictly punitive? And what are we doing to create a climate of campus and school safety within our community? And that's really the importance where technology can be very helpful in accelerating us towards those goals, but we have to make sure this entire time that we're based on that responsiveness and the ability to reinforce, if not instill, confidence that when somebody does report, it's going to be handled properly and acted upon.
Chris.
Yeah, so I want to jump on what Jonathan was just saying and touch on what Brandon said earlier, because I'm watching the questions pop up, and they're all most are brilliant, like things that I haven't thought of from going down to the audience participation level, because we tend to think of these things from middle north, and going backwards. I took some notes here. Jonathan mentioned the community work and Brandon mentioned the street rules. So I think everyone's looking for the solution to meld those two things and make it okay to quote unquote Sandy Hook style, see something, say something. And if we, how many times, and I would ask the whole audience this, and especially the panel, how many times have you gone to work, read a report and been involved in something that says, oh, we all knew he was going to do that. We all knew she was capable of doing that, and no one took action. And to the higher point of what do you do, that's the deeper level of how to come up with a strategy that's not one size fits all, but holistic to the actual place that you're trying to instill. Because what works at a small daycare of 10 kids is not going to work at a national chain for daycare, because you have different decision makers. So to your question exactly, Ara, was who do you notify? What do you do? There's been so many examples recently of failed prevention because quote unquote, everyone knew there was a problem with this person, specifically students for this context, and didn't make a decision. So like Awarity would call something like this gaps, silos, and disconnects. And I'm affiliated with them, not by working with them, just because I believe in their product, but they bring that information from the bottom, take it up, and hold a person accountable to actually do something on a multiple layer. This isn't a commercial for that. This is going right back to what Jonathan said. There are things that exist that do that. And if we can get that information up and get the information from where Brandon said the street cred of not, quote unquote, not snitching, but not his words, my own, but bringing that information to light, and we get that to the right people, we don't have to leave this with a sole decision maker. We can make that decision maker that true threat assessment team. And if you just take a look at a couple massive shootings, the last ones in, let's say, the top 5 school shootings in the last 10 years, they all had threat assessment teams. They all had behavioral people. They all had counselors, and quote unquote, everyone knew it was going to be that person that did something, and yet it still happened. So that's where I'm an advocate for the thing that I came up with, which is called PRO. And I'm not selling anything. I'm just saying this is what it is. Prevention, response, and options. And if we use the run, hide, fight model, or we use the ALICE model, or we adapt the alert program, it doesn't matter. It's interchangeable enough that this isn't about a monetary business model. This is about the human model. How are we going to save kids? How are we going to save people? And if we don't start offering prevention and what it really means with response, because you have to have it, and then options like, an apparatus, a windshield apparatus that can actually, save kids if something goes truly wrong. If we're not doing those 3 things, we're kind of failing and falling and relying back on just run, hide, fight, or, no offense to Brandon, because I think he's on board with what I'm saying, just ALICE. We have to have multiple layers. And Jonathan and you, and even Brandon as a school board member, what's the return on prevention? Well, what's the return on regret, right? I wish I did that. That's not a very good strategy.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris. And I say this in all my trainings, and I'll say it here, but it lines up to what you're saying. When the time to perform has come, the time to prepare has passed. And that's where when you talk about what's the cost, and doing these things, there's some sort of cost involved, whether it's time, whether it's money, there's a cost. But I don't think that there's a single person on this webinar who thinks that there is a dollar amount that can equal a value to a human life.
No, absolutely not. And along those, Chris, you mentioned before, Run, Hide, Fight was relevant in 2013 or years in the past. What are what has changed? What are some contributing factors that have presented recently that didn't exist back then?
Right. Well, obviously the advent of, and if you would allow, I'll go backwards to 1999 in Columbine, we saw a national shift of police don't surround and drown, just like the fire department model, right? Something's on fire, you surround it, you make sure it doesn't catch other things on fire. The active shooter model was surround it with police, wait till SWAT shows up, stop the shooter. And then pretty soon the national commitment was, okay, we're going to send a 2-officer response team. And that sounded really good until it came to the single officer showing up and realizing I've got 3 more minutes to wait, and they continued to hear gunfire. And the simulations, and the U.S. Army did a whole bunch of them, and the Department of Justice did. Everybody conducted these studies, but none more than the Secret Service. And they dove right into these things, and they realized just briefly in 2019, 100% in the 2019 study, and the Secret Service study is always 2 years behind because they have to aggregate the data. 100% of the people that committed active shooter events showed some type of demonstrable behavior. It's a little bit of a disingenuous number because I'm sure I went out and yelled at my neighbor one day. Is that a contributing factor? I'm not going to be an active shooter. So we have to discern between that 100%. So R and I have talked about this. 43.7% of all shooters told someone they were going to do it. So if the 4 of us just go after those 40, say round up 44%, we just knocked this in half. So what's changed? The philosophy, the model, and then when you look at the response, unfortunately, National Tactical Police Officers Association just came out with a new saying for their training for law enforcement officers. It's called doomed captives. Okay. I'm not sure where I can answer for all of us. I think my family, I don't want my family to be a doomed captive anywhere. I want my family to be able to survive anything. But that doesn't mean they're going to go up and stab someone in the eye because they're prepared to fight an assailant. It just means we have to come up with better strategies, and the options to present into Run, Hide, Fight or into ALICE or into about 3 other models, they exist. And we need to put them forward as a human model, not a business model. And I think we're stuck in our own silos, in our own business mind saying, okay, this is my competitor and this. So instead, the pro model brings all competitors together. And there's no competition except how many lives can we save. Use the White House. It used to be an open place to go in, visit. It's the most secure residence in the world, and it's the most protected person with the most threats in history. And yet it had an open front door. It's possible to prevent anything. It's the will, desire, and a little bit of monetary policy that we have to shift our focus to. And we can save every child, not just hopefully the ones and twos.
That's right. It is all about prevention. And on that note, Jonathan, kind of circling back about the community oriented approach, what role do students have in prevention of active shooter at schools and campuses?
Well, and this comes down to the feedback loops that we were mentioning before, and that's the Secret Service and Department of Education study that I believe Chris was citing before, right? They were able to prove if students, stakeholders in the school community are more confident that an institution or school will be responsive to a report, then they're more likely to not just report, but you'll see a decrease in the risk for an incident. And the flip side of that, which the research proves, is that when there isn't that confidence, the risk for a harmful event actually increases. So what needs to be done with students is, and this could be as simple as, these aren't the red flags, but what are the green flags? What are the good signs that we are being inclusive of the voices of our students and their families? Do you have students that are representatives on your school board, on your committees, on your Safe Schools Committee? Is there an open door policy that they're able to have that type of discussion or bring an issue up with not just your board members, but your cabinet? What type of organization does your school have, no matter what the size, when it comes down to ensuring that all student voices are heard? We all know, those of us in law enforcement and security, right? We're only as strong as those which are most marginalized or not represented. Where is their voice in your school community? Only then can we try to attain that full coverage of communication that constantly occurs and churns and evolves, that creates a culture which is going to be more preventative, that's going to be more caring and embraces the diversity of different backgrounds, ways a community member might have perspectives about safety and security of school. And it's through that diversity that we're able to gain strength through the communication. And that's where the technologies that we've mentioned it can help, whether it's a safe to say something program, other types of anonymous reporting. But let's also go back down to brass tacks and basics. And not all schools can afford this, most can't, but what does your counselors program look like? Do you have climate coordinators in your schools? Is that an investment? Ultimately, it's not all about the money, but I'll bring this full circle again. You want to see where someone's priority is for safe schools? Do they have a line item in their budget and what is being funded? That will tell you how much prevention as opposed to simply hardened response that a school district or institution is investing in.
Jonathan, I'll jump on that real quick. I when you're thinking about this, my mind automatically went back to my days as an SRO. And for those of you who don't know what an SRO is, pardon my acronym jargon, that's the school resource officer. But when I was a first year SRO, we were still, I mean, the Nokia flip phone had just come out. And so there was no app technology of, any kind. And so we've come such a long way. But when you talk about, when R asked a question about the community, and to your point, right, like what are the people, these are the people in your neighborhood, right? We remember that song. But I remember having boxes in the main office, and a kid could come by and just drop me a note in that box, right? And through the relationships, through building the relationships, students would come. I will tell you, I will freely admit, I solved more crime as an SRO than I ever did as a boot cop or a detective, right? Because the stuff that was happening on the street after school was being reported to me in school, and I was able to give our detectives, hey, this is the person you need to look for this carjacking. This is the person you need to look for this assault, for this burglary, for whatever it is, right? And that wasn't because of technology, right? And so I'm not knocking technology. We have technology today, and I think you said it can be great, and then it can also be a terrible resource. But the relationships, right? So when Ara asked the question about the community, that's the part about getting left of boom for this stuff, right? Is those, the foundation of those relationships, that person coming in, and they used to call me OR, right? They come out and go, OR, so-and-so is, this is supposed to happen at 7th period, or, this fight's going to happen after school at this bus stop. Or, I remember there were times where we'd get a missing kid report, and I go to, some of my folks in the school and say, hey, so-and-so is missing. I need them home by 4:00 today. Right. And guess what happened? By 2:35, they were home. Right. And so those relationships are important. And so I think, Jonathan, to your point, you're getting to, right, some of that human interaction, building those relationships, understanding, getting that community, right, getting people to talk. And I think we will find that the more we have genuine conversation, it's 2021, almost 2022. Everybody's busy. We all have devices, and we just move and go. But if we actually take a moment and slow down and listen for understanding, not for right or wrong, but listen for understanding, I think that is going to be a huge shift in this prevention piece and getting left of boom. And then all the other things, right? All the technology pieces and all those other things will they'll still be there, right? They'll still serve their function. But to your point, are asking about the community question, Jonathan, you answered. I think that is huge. Unfortunately, I just don't think that there are enough people around that think the way like we do.
Well, and that's the work that we have ahead of us, is to build that culture of safety, of community involvement when it comes to prevention of harm. I'm going to start taking some questions here from our audience that keep coming in. We could discuss this all day. Let's talk about the point where you need to initiate a lockdown. So Craig DeWarf asks, please share how a lockdown is initiated on a campus and how all facility occupants are warned of the threat.
So I think that happens in a couple of different ways, right? Some of that is, again, going to be, whether it be a technology piece, whether it be a PA system that is accessible within the entire campus, whether it's an alert, maybe it's a panic button. So lockdowns can be initiated in several different ways. What I think is important is whatever system, whatever route you're taking to initiate that lockdown, I think it's important for that pathway, that vehicle, to include information, right? Why are we going into this lockdown? Where is the threat? Because that's going to help me make a good decision about next steps. And so that's really, you can initiate lockdowns, again, through many of the ways that I just mentioned, but that should also include some information that helps you get to that decision of that lockdown and the next decision thereafter.
And is there a two-way communication tool out there? And I know they exist. I know there's several of them, but are there preventative tools out there for smart camera technology, the communication to provide a feedback loop that it's not overwhelming the system itself when something goes wrong? And going back to the Mike Tyson famous saying, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. Well, the same thing. If you don't test your strategy for lockdowns, if you don't test your lockdown to a stressing and breaking point, you won't know what works and what does not.
Yeah, 100% agree, Chris. I always tell people in our trainings, you can have the world's best system. You could pay $1 million for it. But to your point, if you can't make that system function the way you need it to function on the day of your event, you are doing yourself a disservice, because that system may be great for 1 or 2 people to access it. What about the 100 people that are going to try to have access to it the moment you need it? Is it going to shut down? Is it going to have failure? Is it going to be able to sustain that usability? And so that's very important, Chris.
Yeah, no, and last month we were discussing the active shooter prevention technology side of things, and it did address that using the gun detection, visual emergency communications, like you mentioned. There's gunshot detection that would also be able to initiate that panic button. So certainly a number of initiating mechanisms, but the question is, what do you do when that happens? And what's important on the prevention side, when we talk about the technology side of things, panic buttons or any of these other initiating mechanisms, is getting a head start to initiate your protocols, your ALICE protocols, Run, Hide, Fight, Pro, whatever those protocols are, getting a head start before a shot is fired. That goes back to the whole prevention side of things. Yeah, you're responding, but we want to prevent harm from even happening. So that's absolutely critical. You can't have one without the other. It's the knowledge, it's the know-how, it's the policies to avert harm, mitigate the scope of harm. We got another question. We got a bunch of questions, so let me just run through these here. So Daniel Martin from Middlesex Community College asks, what is the best practice if a firearm is pulled during an actual threat? Has that ever come up? That's interesting premise.
We get that question all the time in training, it's when you think about pulling the fire alarm, that's one mandated response. The question becomes, is that the right response for everybody? And for some people, evacuation will be the right response, right? For some people, evacuation may not be the right response because it could put them in the path of harm's way. And so that's, and I get the thinking there, right? If we ultimately want people to remove themselves from the dangerous location and leave, then why don't we initiate that by pulling the fire alarm? But again, that demands one response. So it takes that option-based approach away from them, we go back to that, it's the same as the one mandated response of, the old lockdown, duck and cover. And so again, thinking about situational environmental awareness, forcing everybody into something that may not, it could be the right response for 90% of the people or 95% of the people, but is it the right response for 100%? And more times than not, the answer to that question is no.
Agreed.
Got it. And so this is interesting. Going back to your SRO point, Brandon. Kevin from Vancouver Public Schools asked, so what is the verbiage for active shooter? There's active shooter, lockdown, lockout, ALICE, run, hide, fight. What is the difference? Who wants to take that one?
So I think I'll speak to the ALICE portion, right? So ALICE is not the verbiage for an incident, right? ALICE is a set of response strategies to help you increase your survivability. And so, the incident of itself, we always refer to it as a violent critical incident, right? That is what it is. And ALICE is a strategy to help you increase your survivability through a method of options to address that violent critical incident.
Jonathan, do you have input?
Yeah, and actually it might be a pivot for a question, because I'd like to hear insights from both of you as well. I think what that question demonstrates as well is that we need to be able to toggle through all of the various, and we've touched on this before, everyone's got a solution. It's really important as leaders to be able to square what that reality is for our situation, and then train accordingly, invest accordingly. Just reminds me as well of NFPA 3000. Right? And then locks on doors, right? We have all these issues that need to be squared by our CSOs, or people who are responsible ultimately for safety and security. And so the question to the question, not so much an answer, but Chris and Brandon, is that, how can those of us listening to this conversation prioritize or have a framework to check through some of these sometimes conflicting standards and programs?
I think there's several. There's several research papers out there, and there's several threat assessment training tools out there provided gratis by the Secret Service. United States Secret Service has programs. The FBI Active Shooter Program Office, which I worked with in 2015, has fantastic resources available that are on the cuff. You can log in. The key is getting the professionals that will be responding, because that is where the mindset is, right? I can talk all day long that we need to be 99.9% prevention, and that way when we have that 0.1% failed prevention, yes, we still need the same attention spent on responding, because we need to stop that shooter. But how many times have we seen, and this is unfortunate, the shooter, everything failed at the prevention, the shooting happens, and yet the shooter's still not stopped. And when they are engaged, X amount of time, 92%, they'll stop, or, other harm will be done. However, the way that you have to start with the original question is, what works for your model? What verbiage are you using? And are you crossing counties? And you have kids coming that were in high school in another state to your college in a third state, because you're playing, say, sports, or you just want to go for the academics. What's the state protocol in where I am, Texas, Dallas, Texas? Lockdown. Well, what does lockdown mean? Lockdown could mean evacuate. So does it really mean lockdown? So semantics matter, and we need to knock that down. And that's where my point was made earlier about prevention, response, and options. One of the tenets to that, oddly enough, or ironically enough, is what all three of you have said. It's about community. When we treat the community that we're serving as a board of directors, if you will, or a board of trustees, everyone is accountable to everyone. The information loop opens up, and the offerings, the products, the options that are out there, while overwhelming, you can call people. Like me, I take 1,000 calls, I take 100 calls a month, I'd say, on the house. I just provide guidance on, check out these 5 systems, because I don't sell anything. That stuff sells itself. Everything's a good idea until you got to sell it. I'm not into sales. So all I'm saying is run, hide, fight needs to be populated. And when you do that, you go to the model of, does evacuation mean evacuation? Does a fire alarm, to Brandon's point, mean a fire alarm? And does lockdown mean lockdown, or does it mean shelter? And what's the difference? When you start solving those minimal questions, you start getting major plans put into place, and then go from there.
Great advice. And so Lanice Warren from California State, San Bernardino asks, what proactive things can universities do to minimize students or employees from becoming active shooters? Any thoughts on that, gentlemen?
I'll relinquish that to a couple of the other guys. I feel like I've monopolized some of the time and conversation here. So,
could you just hit that question one more time, Aura, please?
Sure. So, what are some proactive things that universities can do to minimize the chances of students or employees from becoming active shooters?
I think that's a weighted question, right? Because we all want to go towards or lean towards perhaps the benefit model, which is, what are we providing? A good workspace, a safe workspace? Are we doing extra things to be kind and cautious to all our employees and students, et cetera? The reality of this is counter to my own popular belief, which is sometimes not so popular, and that's okay, because it's my belief. But it goes to the response side. Are you hardened? Do you have a hardened facility? Do you have the aura walking around the campus, and when you get hired there or you're attending school there, do you realize that, hey, there are police officers, there are community safety officers, there's school resource officers, there are, whether you have an armed teacher program, preposterous or not, I mean, they have them across the country, so we need to address them. Do we have, the armed teacher program? Where are you in what part of the country? The point is, when you start giving the feeling of safety and security, and then you back that up with actions, to Jonathan's early point, where's your line item and what are you doing? And you start offering ballistic material. You start offering ALICE training. You start putting in place even run, hide, fight little signs. And then you talk to everybody about it as a community. You've just now solved about, who's to say, but over 90% of your problems.
And I'd reinforce that, right? Okay, I'm the Cleary guy, and I truly believe in what the Cleary Act has been able to do. This is for higher education. It's a Consumer Protection Act, and it's right. Accountability comes from communicating, being transparent, and showing your data. And when that happens with a community, you are actually facilitating deeper discussions about the resources, where problems are and how they could be prevented, or even what the response is to those type of crimes. And institutions who are much more open about communicating, not what their brass tacks plans are, but the resources they have, the technology they use, maybe the campus safety apps that many universities also use. But ultimately, are they communicating what it is they're doing? And to each campus with its own resources and all those variables that Chris mentioned, if an institution is reporting genuinely on what it is that they bring to the safety conversation, well, then the community can hold accountable and be a part of that conversation and identifying those gaps. The last piece of it for the campus community aspect is, what are you doing? I mentioned this before, but to make sure that as many members of your campus community, could be those who are transient in an open campus setting who are coming through, what resources do they have? Mental health first aid, is that training available to those on campus? What about food insecurity, which could be up to upwards of 50%? That's a stressor, which also occurs. All of this adds up in the constellation of variables that none of us have any control over, except that which we can reduce through our preventative programs, not just our response.
No doubt. And let's see, Dewey from University of Virginia. I think we lost Brandon here. Brandon, I don't know if you're still on. We lost your video. Dewey asks, how can schools achieve a balance between reactive and preventative safety strategies, and what would be components of each? It's a pretty open-ended question.
I think, right. So I think going back to everything we've discussed, and here's Brandon, let him take that if he heard that question. But on the front side, the balanced approach is, do you fit all three tenets of these basic principles? And, you can look at, I digress back to sales, and I'm not in sales, but, you read about it enough, or you know about it enough, and pretty much you're selling human safety and security. People buy for two reasons: fear of loss and a desire for gain. So as long as you can balance those two things without selling fear to your community, you're going to get that desire for gain and the more buy-in. And that's just an obvious 50,000 foot view.
Brandon, did you hear the question?
I missed the question. So what, can you repeat it, please? I'm sorry.
Sure. I think this is definitely a reality. So how can schools achieve a balance between reactive and preventative safety strategies, and what would be components of each? How do you balance the two?
It's difficult, right? And I say this all the time. We want to balance safety and convenience, right? And that's challenging to do, because if you want a really safe environment, you got to give up some convenience, right? And we saw that. So we saw schools and organizations go to key fob systems, and all the doors are locked, and you can only use. And so we gave up some convenience to get some safety there. And so I think finding that balance is going to be going back to Jonathan's point, and some of the things I said about really engaging in the human aspect of the folks within the organization, right? I said it before, and I'm going to say it again. We have to get better at communicating. We have to get better at understanding the issue or the problem, and not about right or wrong, right? And so if we can get to, folks demonstrate behaviors, right? Folks will tell, the leakage will happen. And so we have to get a hold of that, right? And really be meaningful and intentional about going down the path of understanding where this person is coming from this, right? And to, I think John made the point about, oftentimes we want to look at it from the punitive side, right? Okay, so you said some magic words that equal suspension, expulsion, whatever the punishment is there. But let's set that aside for a minute, and let's understand why did you say these things? Why are you making these drawings? What's happening here? Let's restore that person to whole, whatever that looks like, right? It may be counseling, it may be therapy, it could be a number of things. And so I think that balance of getting to left of boom, that prevention, that human perspective. And then the other side is, okay, now we have to deal with it, and that's a whole nother level. And so while I don't know that we will balance, I think we will definitely lessen the disproportion of the two to get closer to a balance, right? And that takes, resources, that takes people, that takes time, and that takes the understanding of the person to, okay, let's have this conversation so that I can understand, not that I can agree or disagree with you, and let's understand, okay, this is the root problem, right? So this drawing, this statement, this action is a byproduct of the root problem, and the root problem is whatever. I'm coming from a domestic home. I'm coming from an abusive relationship. I've seen my parents, be involved physically, domestically, whatever the root trauma is. And then I think that will help shape us a little bit closer to that balance. And if we are able to do that, I think the success of getting, to the left of boom could even shift to where we are actually able to be more preventive, right? To get to your zero now. And maybe that responsive piece becomes less because we don't have to respond to such incidents because we've addressed the problem on the left of boom.
Amen. And that's where we need to be, Brandon. Yes, Jonathan.
If I could add to that, when it comes down to one of the tools that I see in this trend, and this started in higher education about a decade ago, what are we doing with climate surveys, which are able to test our blind spots? We have to understand the perceptions and the reality about what our school and the wider community of stakeholders perceive. And it's when we sustain a program like that, that is an investment in this community engagement that we're talking about. There's some communities on one end of the spectrum, they might want it to be like a prison yard and have very safe and secure schools, while others may be on the other end of completely wide open and no SROs whatsoever. However, so long as you're engaging and communicating and that feedback loop exists, then the values of the community can be reflected in the actual program. It's when we have these varying misperceptions and a community that isn't able to hold accountable or share what it actually wants to see in a program. Well, the more that we're able to facilitate that communication, that comes back to that seesaw, right? That's going to help to create a better opportunity for balance, which is where where I feel most, campus public safety and school security programs, that's what they're aiming for.
We have probably one last question. David Freed has been patiently waiting on this question here. So, and this is very specific and actually hits home with me too. I'm very involved at a school with children with special needs. And so he asks, if we have a school with 30% special needs that includes cognitive and mobility challenges, should we allow the other 70% to flee during active shooter while locking down and sheltering our special needs students? And David mentioned that he's received conflicting information, conflicting advice about this. So he's looking towards your perspectives on how to handle that situation.
I'm going to, if you guys don't mind, I'll go with a quick 1 minute thing. A notorious thing I say, I'm a large keynote speaker across the country right now. Well, I was for many years and getting back in it. One of the things I say is when you're trying to develop a plan, does your plan sustain for multiple facets of active shooter protocols, domestic terrorism? What's the next generation of shooting we're going to see? I won't broadcast that, but probably we've already started to see it back in '99 with Columbine with IEDs. So if you can answer this question, if you evacuate 70% of your students and you leave the other 30% there, what happens if there's, say, a bomb and it's a real threat, more than a threat, and it's actually an IED there? Are how do you address those children? Are you putting them in to go to Jonathan's point, far right side, and I don't mean left and right of political, I mean just the far right side of the seesaw? What happens? Do we put them in a bomb-proof container and teach them there from now on? Or do we keep it realistic and keep that school from allowing that portion or that location from outside contributing factors to access that 30% of the population? And if you're trying to commingle them, well, then you need to come up with a shepherd plan where 5 students are responsible, or however, with the differential is 3 to 1 is responsible for the one special needs child that needs help. And, I teach this at emergency rooms and hospitals. If something goes wrong and you're operating, well, the police officers are trauma surgeons, and the trauma surgeons don't want to really die. So what do they do with their patient? They have a 3 to 1 ratio that they use. Just some high level thoughts, and hope that gives some clarity.
Somebody asked about squeeze one question there about funding, and how do schools find funding for trainings and protocols and active shooter prevention measures? And perhaps Jonathan and Brandon might have some insights as school board members.
Well, that's a wide-ranging blue book answer that I'd be happy to follow up with whoever asked that question. Actually, Brandon and I both would. But you also have to have the right people. It could be anyone in the community. Do you have champions for what school safety means, right? And that selfless approach and commitment to public service. It could be from within the school or without. I'm amazed by how many security experts live within our district and law enforcement officers, and the answers that we're able to get from our community to identify things that I had no idea about. And so what are we doing to engage? And that is going to raise awareness, which is going to drive the priority of what we need for funding. The bottom line answer is there isn't enough. There are too many unfunded mandates. And tragically, unfortunately, it's the response after. Look at Florida. They've got some amazing laws and mandates now. But like I've seen, whether it's higher ed or K-12, it unfortunately comes with loss of life that we finally start to make the investments that we need.
Exactly. And we have run out of time, and just wanted to a couple points, and really it sounded like the most recurring theme that we heard today was the importance of community, right? This is not just about a checklist of things to do. It's not just about technology. It's about community engagement, building a culture of safety as part of that whole preventative measure. So we're going to continue this conversation. We appreciate your time. I want to let the folks that joined us appreciate their participation. The next webinar is January 18th, the next sessions, and we're going to be covering a number of topics in 2022. This is our last sessions for this year, but we're going to be covering crisis communications, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, robotics, and we want to hear some of the topics that you would like to hear about and participate in. So once we end this webinar, you're going to see a survey, and you'll receive an email survey which will ask just a few questions about this. I think there's only 3 questions, but if you could also let us know what topics are of interest that will help you in your journey to get to zero. If you're interested in becoming a member of ZeroNow, please visit zeronow.org. And wanted to thank Jonathan, Chris, and Brandon once again for sharing your expertise and insights today. And we'll see you all very soon. Have a happy holiday, new year, and we'll see you in 2022. Thanks, guys.